So my mother always wanted to be a writer, never even tried, but she made us look up every single word. She revered literary people. She loved going to lectures. And if anybody was articulate, that just moved her very deeply. And my dad always wanted to be a Broadway show director, writer, producer. And he never did that either, but he invested in some Broadway shows just so he could go to opening night. He loved the smell of the grease paint so much. So he instilled the love of entertainment in us, and she instilled the love of literature in me. Actually, I can tell you one memory that was really powerful. When I was about 6, we were driving by a cornfield in winter, so just the stalks were sticking up out of the snow. And I said, "Mom, that looks like old man's beard." And she said, "That's a simile." And I said, what's a simile? And she said, well, when you compare something using like or as. And from then on, I've really been like a simile whore my whole life. I love similes. I love the quality of similes. I love making them. And I really do date a lot of my desire to please people through writing to that moment with my mother.
I think that's a familiar story. You know, conversations that I will have with writers, usually if you drill down into it, there will be a teacher or an adult, a parent, some family member who offered encouragement or inspiration or some kind of nudge, or, you know, sometimes it's leading by example. And that has a huge impact. And when you look back at it, it's a very small moment. It's nothing pyrotechnic, right? And yet here you are recalling it all these years later and like locating it as a formative experience for you as a creative person.
Definitely.
Did you feel growing up the desire that your parents had to write or direct, you know, these kind of creative impulses that were unrealized in your parents professionally? At what point did you become conscious of that?
I think when I was older, because I did start keeping diaries when I was 8 years old. And they were not profound. They were basically, we had hot dogs tonight and I hate my sister. Those were the variations on the theme. But we had a crawl space beneath the stairs, and I had a blanket and pillow and a little lamp that I dragged in there. And that was a very sacred place for me. So I was already communing through diaries at a really young age. And I don't think I understood that my parents had these dreams until I knew my dad really wanted to be involved in theater. I don't know how apocryphal it was, but he was in the Army, and he actually couldn't get into the Army because he was too heavy, and he volunteered, and he wrote radio shows with a guy named Phil Silvers. And he had hoped when he came back from the war to continue doing that. And apparently there was some letter that he had a potential job doing that my grandfather ripped up and forced him to work in the store. So I don't know if any of that's true, but that was always like one of the stories that we had always heard about my dad. And then my mother.
He had to like what, take over the family business, it sounds like? Like what kind of store?
It was just a little, what do you call it? Like a little newsstand, cigarette store, soda, just a little store in Brooklyn. And then from there, he was sort of pushed to go into the family, not even our family, like a cousin of a cousin's lumber yard. And then he wound up doing that his own life, and then eventually having his own lumber yard. So there was definitely a narrative that he did not fulfill his dream. And he always took us to Broadway shows and listened to soundtracks. I mean, you knew that that's what he loved, and that he wasn't going to get to do that. And then my mother, once I got my first typewriter, Smith Corona two-tone, I remember my mother saying, I'd like to try to write something. And she didn't know how to put the paper in the typewriter, you know, and I always remember that as this like tragic moment that here this woman wanted to write, and she didn't even know how to, you know, cue up the paper in the typewriter.
Well, it's not uncommon for me to talk with writers who, in publishing their books, are realizing a latent or unrealized dream that their parents had, that they somehow felt. And I think sometimes we feel these things implicitly rather than explicitly. We intuit that our parents have this desire, especially when we're young and we're not maybe fully equipped to understand, or we don't have the language for it. But it's powerful, the unrealized dreams of our parents.
Oh,
And
it's so powerful.
and your parents are no longer with us. Is that
Right. Yeah.
they would be thrilled, I would imagine, to see you publishing books and to see you publishing your debut novel. Correct?
Yes. I mean, they were thrilled when I edited books and I was acknowledged in the back. My father would read the acknowledgments to anyone who walked in the house just to show that I was connected with a book. They were so proud of that. And he, by the way, wanted me to go into the lumber business. So how strange was that, that he was really disappointed when I went to get an MFA. He was like, why don't you get an MBA? And I was like, we're going to swap out the B for the F, Dad.
So you go off to college, I believe at NYU first.
Yes.
And what did you study there?
Well, this is really the other really important part of my origin story is that I got accepted into the film school. And the film school was only around for 3 or 4 years at that point. It didn't even have its own building. We were in some, makeshift building. And I don't really know how I got in because I'd only made a few Super 8 animated movies in my senior year. But I got in, and after my first year, I was invited to leave, meaning they didn't throw me out of NYU, but I could no longer be in the film school, and I had to go into arts and sciences. Getting kicked out of that film school set me on a completely different course in my life. And I have never given up the dream, actually, of writing screenplays. And I've written a bunch, and I still continue to pursue that. Crazy, insane. And you're out there in LA, so you really know what.
Everybody, it maybe feels like it's diminished a little bit, but I remember it would be nerve-wracking to go into a coffee shop. It's like unpleasant because you're like looking around, like literally everyone's on their laptop writing a screenplay.
Yes.
In every coffee shop, just multiplied throughout the city, and it just
no, I know. I've been there. My sister's a TV writer, and we often took when I'd visit her, we'd take our laptops, and I had my first Arnold Palmer, and to me it was so so sexy and amazing. But I always said I'll never move to LA unless I have a deal. I'm not gonna do that. I'm successful enough in book publishing to satisfy a lot of my, need and desire to work with writers and do all of that. So I had a couple of close calls, as one does, and that kept me going. But I'm pretty realistic about it at this point, though. I mean, it's still my dream.
I mean, it's so fickle, the business, and my understanding of it anyway, that doesn't really have a ton of logic to it. The way that it works and the way that fortunes can rise and fall. I mean, yeah, there's got to be talent. Yeah, there's got to be hard work. But a lot of it seems to come down to timing, knowing the right people, getting your project into the right hands at just the right time. I mean, I don't know how to game it out. I don't know if anybody really does. But I'm curious to know why you were asked to leave the film school. Like, was there a project that you put forward that they felt was not up to par, or was it just...
I think it's two things. One is the other students were really pretty good. Some of them were quite good. They'd been making films since they were 8 years old or something, with Super 8 cameras, and they were very good. And as I said, I'd only made these little animated things. But what I was told was that I had a preponderance of 360-degree pans in all of my movies. And my professor actually said that it made him nauseous. And, when I go in a room, I like to see I like to look around. That's all I thought I was doing. I had no idea what I was doing. And I also, my first film was of my boyfriend, who was a guitar player who I met in Washington Square Park. I mean, it was ridiculous. And it was so immature. But he was very kind. He just said, listen, you might be a great filmmaker and writer someday, but I think you should just go and read a lot of books and, get as much education as you can and then come back to film. And I was crushed, but I also was happy I wasn't being completely thrown out of school. I also, because of said boyfriend, I was also almost failing a couple of other classes too, because I wasn't going to class that much. And I wasn't even like this hugely rebellious person. I was just having my first relationship and was so intoxicated by that. So my freshman year was pretty bad academically.
Yeah,
And
I think that's common. I mean, mine was. My sophomore year wasn't even that hot. If we're going to be honest about it, but I feel like for me, undergrad, I didn't have a ton of interest in being in school. I wanted to be like alive and see stuff and go do stuff and be free. That was the feeling that I had.
yes. Well, now that I'm reading all my diaries from my 20s, and then I'm still I'm my senior year of college up in my diaries, and I'm seeing it everywhere in my journals. Like, I want to learn, but I don't want to learn, what what I'm being taught in these courses. And yeah, I'd always been like a good little girl and an A student in high school. So it was a kind of a shock that I wasn't performing up to speed. And I also thought NYU was a come down. It was my safety school. But I really wanted to be in the Village. So I was very happy. I didn't want to go to college. I wanted to go to the Village. That's really what I wanted. I just wanted to be there.
And you get through. You did get a degree from NYU, correct?
I did by the skin of my teeth.
And what was the major at that point? It was
English.
English. Okay.
With a minor in anthropology.
And then, I think that's a good education for a writer. I've
Sure.
often lamented the fact that I didn't study anthropology in particular. I feel like anthropology is a really cool sort of angle to take when you're approaching writing fiction, because the reading and writing part of it, I think you ultimately have to do that labor on your own and to develop your sensibility. But having a kind of 30,000 foot understanding of the species, like, that seems useful. Has it proven to be useful to you?
Absolutely. And it was a crazy year or 2 years at NYU because the head of the department was caught making LSD in the labs and was fired. And half of the professors were out, and they had to bring in these professors just, sort of on the spur. And they brought in this couple of people from the New School who were very revolutionary in their thinking. And the most important book I read in an anthropology class was The Interpretation of Dreams by Freud. And we looked at that anthropologically, and I still have my copy, and it's marked, I've marked it all up and underlined. And that was mind blowing to me. But then, reading Margaret Mead and all that stuff too, and systems and culture. I did love anthropology, actually, more than English, probably. I wasn't interested in Beowulf or Chaucer. I can promise you that.
Yeah, I wasn't either. I remember reading that stuff, and like, I took a Brit Lit class in college and was just like, I'm bored. I hate to say it, but I was.
Yeah.
I know that you then went on to get your MFA, as you mentioned earlier, in poetry at Columbia.
Yes.
Nothing sets you up for a lucrative future like an MFA in poetry, right?
That's right. As my dad would attest, yes.
That's right. That's right. So can you just talk about that experience? Because I read that you stopped writing poetry the day you graduated from your MFA. So it was a very concentrated period as a poet.
Well, no, I had been writing poetry since high school and all through college. I was kind of closeted about it, though I did take a couple of creative writing classes in college, and I did win a prize, which was shocking and amazing, since I wasn't anybody's favorite student. We had to submit things anonymously. I think I would not have won otherwise. It was really a fantastic thing. And then before I get my MFA, 2 years, I couldn't get a publishing job. I couldn't type fast enough. But my parents said, if you can't pay your rent, you're coming home. So I basically took what I could get, which was, believe it or not, a job in the corporate library of Morgan Stanley. And I was the corporate file coordinator, meaning I was pulling documents all day on microfiche and having documents flown up from Washington whenever companies filed quarterly reports. and mergers and acquisitions papers and things like that. But while I was at that library in that soul killing, horrible job, depressed out of my mind, I would go to the Gotham Book Mart, which was a couple of blocks away on 47th Street, that very famous tiny bookstore that had everything in it. And the little sign, Wise Men Fish Here. Have you ever been there? Had you ever
I
been
have
there?
not. No.
Amazing. Right in the middle of the Diamond District on, I think, 47th Street, 48th. Anyway, there was a little sign for a free poetry workshop. And I sent in my little fragments and I got in. And the teacher was Jory Graham, right before she became Jory Graham. Her first book was about to come out. So I had this workshop with her, and that was probably the most life-changing experience of my life, because we each got a private session with her. Went into my private session, stop me if this is going on too long, and she reads this long poem. And I say, "Oh my God, that's amazing. Whose is that?" And she said, "That's yours." I said, "What are you talking about?" And she had put my fragments together and used transitions and filled in some little transitions for me. And suddenly I saw that I could write a full poem, not just a fragment. And I ran home and I had hundreds of fragments, and I started putting them together thematically, and I started writing these longer poems. And that's what got me into Columbia. And Jory wrote me a letter too, a recommendation. So that's what happened during those 2 years. One was I knew I was never going to be stuck in a job I hated. I thought I'd probably become a teacher. But then Jory happened to me, and those poems happened to me. And by the way, I got rejected from every other program. So I was prepared to not get into an MFA program. And I remember also telling myself, if you don't get in, then it's on you if you quit writing, right? Like if you're going to let an institution tell you that you're not a poet or you're not, then that's your fault. So I made this pact with myself, that I would either continue writing or just not be bitter about it as the rejections came in, to bolster myself. And then the last one that arrived was Columbia, and I got in. And
wow, it only takes one.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting to me, this fragment thing. You had been writing little fragments, and that's pretty much it. You had never sustained or thought to keep going, right? It was just like these little bits or flights of inspiration or flashes of language that would occur to you. Do you think that it was a confidence issue? Did you have a lack of confidence in your ability to write a poem, or was that just what you liked to do at that time?
When I look in my diaries, I actually had a lot of long column poems, but they made no sense really either. I didn't understand what a line was. I didn't really understand what a line break was. To me, a line break now is drama. Like I really understand the importance of a line break. I didn't understand any of that. I was just flailing, but I was also reading. I was reading a lot of poetry. A lot of it went over my head, but it somehow soothed me and made me feel good, even though I couldn't understand exactly why. And of course I loved Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton, which is, the cliche, but I also really loved Robert Lowell and John Ashbery. People who I really did not understand what they were doing, but I was really drawn to it. So I think a lot of what I was doing was just imitating. But when I came to finally type things up from my notebooks to paper, I just was putting down, maybe the longest poem would be 8 or 9 lines. I couldn't even get to a sonnet, Maybe it was confidence. Maybe so much of what I had written in my diaries was so cringeworthy that I just sort of picked out the things that felt more poetic to me. I really didn't know what I was doing. When I won that prize at NYU, it was a shock,
And you said earlier, you said about that prize that it was submitted anonymously, and that was part of the reason why you think you won.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Though the teacher didn't like me. The teacher did not like me. And in fact, also in my diary, I found a little bit of dialogue that says, "Miss Lerner, where are your poems today?" And then my response is, "I don't have them, sir. You've killed my desire to create." I'm sure I never said it, but I wrote that in my diary. I hated the guy, and I knew that he preferred the really, really pretty pretty poetry girls. And yeah, if my name had been on that poem, he never would have selected it.
Did you get his reaction when he realized it was you?
I think I did. Yes, I think I did. And, I've always really liked being underestimated in my life, which I have been quite a lot because I'm not super fancy or fashionable or anything like that. So, yeah. Yeah, I really hated him, and I thought he was a shitty poet too, FYI.
Can you? I feel like, well, I guess you can, but it's like, can you be like a really shitty human and be a great poet? It seems kind of hard. I guess people have pulled it off, but it seems like especially poetry, you would have to have something good going on at the soul level to write a good poem. But maybe I'm just hoping.
Yeah, I think poets are pretty shitty
You
by and large. Yeah.
Why?
Well, all writers are narcissists, right? And, I think the more commercial you are, the more normal you are because you want to communicate with a lot of people. And then the more obscure you are, the kind of stranger you might be, or least interested in that. I don't know. I mean, I mean, poets are also all writers are pretty ruthless, right? Like you want to take from the world what you're going to use for your writing. And when you have so few words to do it with and such a little audience to potentially connect with, and I don't know. But I mean, if we think about a lot of our great poets, they were pretty awful. It's a costly thing to try to be. Very few make it, however you might define that, it's a really hard life.
Yeah,
And most
poetry in
people don't,
particular.
most people have other jobs and everything, or they teach, or that kind of thing to sustain that. But I don't know. Any poet I've ever been involved with has pretty much broken my heart.
Fascinating. Yeah, I mean, now that you're saying this, I'm thinking back on some of the poets I've known, and there's one in particular that's a doozy. So I guess there's some truth to it. But you get out of your MFA program, and I'm going to kind of press fast forward probably a bit, but you end up working as an editor and a literary agent.
Yeah.
As I kind of said at the top, you've had a varied career in and around books and literature, and have kind of worked in all phases or most phases of the process.
Yeah.
Was it editorial first?
Yes. The other great thing I got out of Columbia was I won this fellowship where I had an automatic job at Simon & Schuster as an intern, rotating in 4 different departments so I could learn. And once I completed that internship, a spot on editorial row opened up and I applied for it and I got it. And that was really what I wanted. So I put all my energy into that. I was like 27 at that point. Most of the assistants were much younger. I really knew I wanted it. So I was probably working twice as hard as anyone around me and soaking up as much as I possibly could. I would take the editors in those days edited on paper, and I would make a Xerox, take it home, take a clean copy, edit it myself, and then compare what I did with what he did and learn how he was editing. I really wanted it very badly, and I I got a few lucky breaks, and then my career took a nice course, and I worked as an editor for 16 years, and then I became an agent.
What were you editing? Like, was there a particular kind of book that you were working with or author that you were working with, or was it varied?
Well, I think I made my mark with memoir. When I was at my my third job, I was at Houghton Mifflin. That's where I became a full editor, from editorial assistant editor. Now I'm a full editor. And I signed up 2 books within like a couple months of each other. One was Prozac Nation by Elizabeth Wurtzel, and the other was Autobiography of a Face by Lucy Greeley. And both of those books did extremely well. And once you have a book that does well, even just one book that does well, you kind of get known for that. And people start sending you that. And it's what I loved because it was the closest thing to confessional poetry. And messy, vulnerable, confessional, personal. That's the kind of writing I loved. So I gravitated toward it. It gravitated toward me.
Having worked as an editor on a book like Prozac Nation, for example, that just takes off and becomes a kind of cultural touchstone and a sign of its times and like a modern classic. What did you learn from that experience and others like it? I guess from an editorial perspective, but just from a publishing perspective, period, about what has to happen for a book to take off like that. Like, I've been asking some variation of this question to guests on this show for 15 years now, but I'm just curious. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Like, when something takes off, do you know, like, can you sense it, or is it always a surprise?
Oh, I knew it. With that book, I knew it. You don't always know it, but everything lined up. I mean, in the first place, I was presented with something. She had written like 600 pages, and the book had been under contract somewhere else. That had all been kept from me. I bought it on a small proposal. Then she shows up with this massive thing, and she had no idea what to do with it. And when I saw it and I helped her shape it into a book, I saw exactly what to do with it. And I knew that it was a page turn. I just knew it would appeal to me, to the young me who was depressed and didn't know how to deal with it. Then there was Elizabeth herself. I mean, beautiful, outrageous, somewhat of an exhibitionist. She was able to put herself out there in a way that a lot of authors just don't. Then there was the fact that she went to Harvard and she worked at some newspapers. I mean, the journalists were interested in her. Then there was the fact that we changed the title. The title had been "I'm So Down I Want to Die" or something like that. And I came up with Prozac Nation, and it was also the moment when listening to Prozac had happened. So Prozac was, this was really in the air and in the culture in a big way. And then the jacket. So we found this really cool young designer who wound up designing the whole Rent, for the Broadway musical Rent. But right before Rent, like, we caught her on the upswing, and she did this photo shoot with Elizabeth in a crop top and put barbed wire. And the publisher looked at me and said, "We don't do that. We don't do that here. We don't publish books that look like that." And I just said, "Oh, you just have to trust me," because I knew that, like, people project themselves onto books or celebrities or whatever. People want to be things. And if you were a depressed girl, you wanted to be Elizabeth Wurtzel, right? Because she made it look really sexy. And I knew putting her on that jacket would be hugely important. So it was the title, the jacket, Elizabeth herself, and then the book itself. And then, really lucky, had a publicist who just fell in love with the book and literally told me, "Don't worry. Like, I know what to do with this book." And so there's that too. There was just the stars aligned.
That's what I was going to say. It feels like there is a coalescence of lots of different factors when a book has that kind of energy and force behind it in the culture and in the marketplace. And you see it happen. I think some of this stuff, it comes down to like personal effort and coordinated effort. Some of this stuff, it's just like you say, it's in the stars.
Yeah. A lot of things have to line up. A lot of pieces have to fall into place. But I could feel that all happening with that book. And every young person at Houghton Mifflin wanted to work on it. Like, people wanted to work on it, versus assigned it. There's a big difference. And you can't manufacture that. That's organic.
So you work as an editor and then transition to becoming a literary agent. That is a relatively common trajectory in recent years, decade. I think in the 21st century, I've noted that a lot of editors have transitioned into becoming literary agents. This was your course. Can you talk about why you made the shift?
Well, most people do it because they get laid off and they can't get back into editorial. I would like to go say on the record that I was not fired. I went of my own volition, and I went for a couple of reasons. I'd had a baby, and this is, pre-COVID, nobody would offer you flex time. There was just no flex time. You couldn't work even a single day or half a day at home when I was at Doubleday. And I was 31 or 32 when I had my daughter, and I just really did not, I wanted to take her to the pediatrician. And it really angered me because I got my books in on time. My books generally did well. I was a team player. I never had any problem with authority. On the contrary, I wanted to please authority. So I was a really good worker. And, but there was no flexibility. And then my previous boss had opened an agency, and he had said to me for a couple of years, like, I'd love you to come join, doors open, write your own ticket, basically. So I didn't want to be an agent in the worst way. I didn't like agents. And I explored that with him when I wanted flexibility. And the other thing was my top 3 authors did not have agents. I had brought them in without agents, and they all came with me. So I knew from the very beginning that I would have clients. And I knew that I brought in a lot of authors without agents because, as I said, I didn't really like agents. I didn't like sitting around waiting for someone to send me something. I knew I was the type of person who could go out and find books. So
Wait, but how did you find them as an editor? Like, how did you find these authors who did not have representation?
I wrote letters. I just wrote letters to people who I thought could write a good book. Pre-internet, like I couldn't even, now it's ridiculous how easy it is to find authors, in my opinion, because so many people are creating content, whether it's TED Talks, YouTube, TikTok, Substack, podcasts. I mean, creative people are one click away. I was reading magazines. I was going to magazine stores when they used to exist, hundreds of magazines. I'd buy magazines, read them, see if the author was somebody whose writing I liked, or if I thought someone had some charisma, or some sort of ability to communicate. I just wrote a lot of letters, and then I followed up. Every 6 months, I'd write them again if I hadn't heard from them, or just a lot of persistence and, creativity and ideas and the desire. So when I made that transition to agent, I didn't want to be an agent, but I knew I thought I was confident that I'd be good at it, and that I could find clients. And my boss let me work from home whenever I wanted.
Who was your boss? Who is this former
It was
colleague of yours?
David Gernert, and he had been the editor-in-chief of Doubleday. He had discovered Grisham, and then Grisham's agent died, and Grisham asked David to be his agent. So, of course, David said, hell yeah.
Yeah, right.
And that's where we hired Erin, actually. I hired Erin.
So we should pause. My agent, Erin Hosier, is like, you mentored her, right? Like she was kind of like your understudy coming into the business. And when I first signed, I remember being at that office in Midtown for the Gernert Company with the great terrace and the whole thing.
Yes. Yeah, it was fantastic time. Really fantastic time. But it was the flexibility. And to this day, it's still the flexibility. And it's also, when you're an editor, you're competing with every other editor in town for every hot project. And you have to do all the work to put an offer together. And then you often lose it because someone else is going to win it if you don't go to the highest number. As an agent, and you can get fired, right? They do downsizing, you lose your job, you're out. But when you're an agent, especially as I am now, a partner in my own company, nobody can fire me. An agent, a client can fire me, right? And go to work with someone else, but I still have my job, And that, to me, knowing that I have that freedom, that nobody can take my job away from me, and that I can work as much or as little as I want and make, whatever money I make on my own back, really. Not waiting for someone else to give me a raise or recognize me or good year, bad year. It's a very liberating thing, but it's also very hard to make a living as an agent. A lot of people don't really make a living wage.
It's hard. And you talk about your approach to finding authors, which is like, you're a self-starter. It's like industrious and proactive. And I think famously you took that approach when you wrote to Patti Smith.
Yeah.
And said, I think you have what did you say? I think you have a book in you. Love, Betsy.
Something like that. Yeah, no one has that letter, which is really sad. Like, I wish I had that letter, but I think I just said, you're an amazing poet and writer, and wondering if, I'm an editor at Doubleday. I wonder if you'd like to get together, talk about a book, that kind of thing, but very respectful and very formal. I was always very formal.
And that was as a editor that you
Yeah.
reached out to Patti Smith?
Yes, I was an editor.
Ah, okay. But then did you work on Just Kids with her, and what, like, because you're her literary agent now, right?
Right. But I'm
Okay,
still her editor too.
Oh, you are? Okay. Because
Yeah.
I'm just like trying to track the process of her writing Just Kids and working with you. Like, were you in your capacity as literary agent at Gernert Company when she started that project, or did that start when you were still at Doubleday?
It started at Doubleday. We did a 2-book deal for a lyric book and a memoir of her youth called, at that time, Picturing Robert. And
Robert Mapplethorpe.
yes. And then we actually did do the lyric book, came out while I was at Doubleday. And I even got her to come to like some Fakakta sales conference, and she played Because the Night. The sales people went crazy. It was definitely a highlight for everybody. It was really, really fun. She's a very good sport, by the way. And then I decide to leave. She's the first person I call, basically, because she also hated agents. She only had a lawyer. She never had an agent. And I knew she hated agents. And I said, please don't hate me, but I'm doing this and I'd love you to come with me. And she said, of course I'm coming with you. Can I be your first client? I was like,
That's not a bad first client.
not a bad first client. So then Doubleday, because Picturing Robert was so many years overdue, they canceled it. And that was the greatest thing that ever happened, because then as an agent, I was free to sell it.
As a proposal or as a finished manuscript?
I think at that point we put about 80 pages together so people could really see what it was, because she had done work at that point. There were more pages to show. I think when I bought those books at Doubleday, maybe there was nothing on paper. So then I had some real pages, and we had a fantastic auction. I mean, everybody wanted it. But it still wasn't called Just Kids. That came really late in the day in the editorial process.
And like, whose idea was Just Kids? Was it like
It was Patty's idea when she wrote that story about the people taking photographs in Washington Square Park, and the husband says they're taking pictures of Patty and Robert just because they look so, cool and artsy. And the husband says, the wife says, I think they might be famous. And the husband says, no, they're just kids. And when she told that anecdote, I think we both had a bit of a feeling for it, but she said, what do you think about this as a title? And I remember writing it down and seeing that both words were 4 letters, and it just looked kind of great. And then it just had this really good feeling about it. And it took. And then of course, it's like now everybody thinks it's the greatest title, but we were not 100% sure about it. No, it felt a little risky.
It's something kind of like sweet and elegiac about it.
Right.
At least maybe you have to read the book, but it went on to, I think it won the National Book Award. Is that right?
Yeah, it did.
What a thrill. So, there's a bunch that we could cover. I'm sure there are many more stories and things that we could talk about in terms of your work in editorial and as a literary agent. But we have to get now to the third phase of your career, which is as a writer. And, you are now celebrating the publication of your debut novel. And prior to this, you published 3 books of nonfiction, including a craft book called The Forest for the Trees, which I read prior to ever knowing you, ever knowing Aaron Hosier, or like this was all like in my early 20s when I was trying to sort out what being a writer would even entail. And
Amazing.
that was one of my favorite books. I was like, this is just, I underlined and dog-eared that book. And then later, to meet you and to end up, being represented by your understudy, it just felt like a small world. But for anybody
Amazing.
listening, Betsy Lerner's The Forest for the Trees is an excellent book. And I think it was reissued, right? Like,
Yeah, I
wasn't there?
updated it. Yeah. But
You
now it's
updated.
out of date again because TikTok didn't even exist. Instagram didn't exist. It was just about Facebook being such a force in the industry.
Yeah, you have to update those kinds of books every like 2 years, it seems like, with the speed of technology. But I want to talk to you about the origin story for Shred Sisters, your new novel, which I think originated for you creatively during the pandemic, as many books that I'm talking about with authors right now seem to have originated. That's just the life cycle that we're in.
Yeah.
But can you just talk about the particular set of circumstances that got you on this track writing this book?
Sure. Yes. And by the way, that just makes me so happy about the forest for the trees.
Yeah,
um,
it was hugely helpful to me.
that's so nice. So there's sort of two tracks. One is just very literally. We were in a rented house in Vermont during the pandemic. In our little bubble, my daughter and my husband and I, we put on Inception. And after about 15 minutes or 20 minutes, I couldn't follow the plot at all. And I just said, I'm out. And I went into the other room, opened my laptop, and wrote the first few sentences of this book and couldn't stop. For 7 months, I just kept writing it. So that's what happened literally. What was happening underneath it all is that a very tragic story. My sister's 2 teenage children were killed by a drunk driver 5 months before the pandemic. And during those 5 months, my older sister and I took turns living with her because obviously they needed a lot of help and support. And then the pandemic came and we went back to our cities, my older sister to Boston, me in New Haven. And we felt we had to keep our eyes on her, and it was really difficult, phone calls, etc. And I came up with this bright idea that we should all, and she was having a hard time getting up in the morning. And I said, let's all work out together in the morning. And we started to work out over FaceTime. The 3 of us would set up our phones on FaceTime, and then we'd all YouTube into the same workout instructor, and we would work out every morning. And we called it shredding, as some people call working out. And then we started calling ourselves the Shred Sisters. And I never thought that when I wrote Shred Sisters, it was always a placeholder. I never thought it would be the title of my book. And then I gave my main character the name Amy Shred, and I didn't know why I did that either, really. I didn't even know why I was writing the book, but I think that what I was doing was processing the pain that we were all in, the fact that as sisters we were very rivalrous and did not really get along all that well, but pulled together in this extraordinary way in the wake of that tragedy. And also my mother had died just before the kids died, so we needed each other in a way that was profound, and we did it. And I think that that's a lot of what the book is really about, is sisterhood and that connection, no matter how fractious the relationships can be. That had to be had. And then my best friend committed suicide about a month after the kids died. And if you've read the book, there's a character that descends into drug addiction and dies. And I think that was also very much working through me. I had a lot to work out. And just writing this book, I mean, not that there's catharsis or anything like that, but I just got to live with it in a way that helped me, help me get through it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you could feel it. I mean, it's definitely a book that attests to the power of family. Like you say, no matter how fractious the relationships, those bonds are not to be underestimated, maybe in particular when times are tough. And this is a book about two sisters. One is named Amy. She's the narrator. She's sort of the brainy, uh, I don't know if obedient is the right word, but she's kind of the good student, the one who's on the straight and narrow by comparison. And then her older sister, Ollie, which is, short for Olivia, is kind of the wild one and maybe the favored child, the one who is lavished with more attention and praise in the family. Ollie's very conventionally beautiful, charismatic, fun, but is also suffering from mental illness. And in the time that this book is set, I don't think as much was known about mental illness and how to treat it. And that part of it was kind of harrowing to read. It made me think. And I don't think there's much diagnostic language in the book for that reason. And I'd love to hear you talk about it. But I know from poking around and doing research that, a lot of people think that you are Amy, right? In the way that we read a novel and sort of assume things about the author, especially, when you know the author. But the truth is that you're a little bit of both. And you yourself have experience dealing with bipolar disorder.
Right.
So can you just talk a little bit about kind of all of the above?
Sure. It is written in the first person, so people always think that whoever the narrator is the author. And I do resemble Amy in a lot of ways. I was a good girl. I was a good student. I'm dutiful. I'm disciplined. I'm hardworking. I don't grab the attention when I walk in a room. On the contrary, you'll see me against the wall looking at everybody. So yeah, in a lot of ways, I'm like Amy. But I was diagnosed with bipolar when I was 15, and I rejected the diagnosis, and I wouldn't stay or be on medication. It took another 15 years before I agreed to go on lithium, which was the drug that saved my life. And I was never like Ollie and my mania. I'm not athletic. I'm not a great beauty. Ollie is very much someone I created, but I did have manic episodes. I had very self-destructive tendencies, and I was very difficult to diagnose. I was misdiagnosed a number of times, and that's part of Ollie's story. And yeah, so I'm Amy and Ollie, and very very much my experience informs both of those characters. I think another thing that became interesting to me is that it's a coming of age novel, and I wrote it in my 60s. I should have written it in my 20s if I'd had my shit together, right? But I wrote it in my 60s, and what I have that other coming of age novels don't have is tremendous perspective. So, for instance, when I was in my 20s, I hated my parents. They didn't understand me. I didn't like how they were treating me. I rebelled. I really just did not get along with them at all. But now I'm a parent, and now I think about what I put my parents through, and I have much more compassion for how they tried and failed to help me. Certainly, if my daughter was having the problems I'd been having, I would be upset every minute of my life. So that perspective, I think, informs the book a lot, and the characterization of these two girls.
Yeah. I mean, you've said of the book that it's a love letter to your 20s and to your loneliness in Manhattan. That definitely comes through in the character of Amy in particular. And you also called it a coming of age novel. And I jotted down as I was reading it that I wrote down the phrase coming of age. That's definitely a useful way to describe the book, but I feel like it maybe doesn't quite do it. It's a book that's coming of age, but it's also really a book about the formation of a human. I feel like it's really about Amy coming to, I don't know, I guess full formation as an adult and an understanding of self And it made me think, this book did, about the ways in which we inevitably form in relationship to others.
Oh, I think, yes. I mean, our families, even our families, I think completely, I mean, yes, genetics, of course, but nurture, siblings, sibling rivalry, these are the things that form us and that we either repeat to good or ill effect for the rest of our lives. You know, people say girls marry their dads and boys marry their moms. Yes, they really do. Or they try to do the 180 opposite of whatever it is. But there's still, it's, you know, it's still the root cause, right, of what you're attracted to or what you need or what you run from. And in the book, you know, Amy, everyone she gets involved with is some version of Ollie, is some kind of chaos. She's just, even if she wants to avoid it, she just keeps repeating it. And that's why we have to go to therapy, right? To untangle and understand just why we're doing self-destructive things, or why we're not in the relationships we want, or how to self-actualize. They say about history, right? You're doomed to repeat it, if you, with that phrase. But I think that's so true. You're just going to keep living your life according to your first family and then your friends and your school. In the workplace, why does the workplace always feel like high school and then always feel like your family? Because that's how we form as communities. And yeah, I think everybody, people always say, what's your sign? And I really want to know, what's your birth order? And were you girls or boys? And, because I can feel like I can know much more about a person when I learn that about them.
I'm the middle child, and I have an older sister and a younger sister.
Oh, nice.
So what does that tell you about me?
Well, middles are difficult, right? We're briefly the baby, which is the best position. Then that gets ripped away from you. But you're also a boy, so you're probably slightly more highly valued than the girls, and you're the only boy in between two girls. So I think that gives you some advantage. Perhaps it depends upon your dad. And, a lot of dads ruin their boys, pretty terribly, and some really make them feel wonderful, and same with their mom. But I haven't met a whole lot of one boy in the middle with two sisters. So that's interesting. I mean, I'm hoping that you really love women. I don't know.
I do gravitate. I've said this before, but if I'm at a party and like all the guys are in one room and all the women are in another room, like I feel most comfortable in the room with the women.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I like to talk to women. I think like women are more generally, I mean, sometimes guys are very good conversation or whatever, but generally speaking, women are more interesting to talk to.
Well, they're more comfortable with being vulnerable, and they're not immediately competing, with you in the way that guys compete. It's not about domination necessarily. I mean, women compete in all sorts of ways, but yeah, I mean, in what ways would you think that you're the typical middle, or not at all?
I think the middle child syndrome, where you feel overlooked or, sort of neglected because too much attention is being lavished on the eldest and the youngest. I never really felt that in an explicit way. I think being the only boy, like you say, might have helped to counterbalance that in some way. If I had been a middle girl, maybe it would have been different, like a middle girl in between two other girls or something. But my parents were wonderful. I can't complain like one bit about my parents, like nobody's perfect, but they tried really hard, and that's the best you can hope for. So
yeah,
I don't know. I think I kind of had like a really lucky ride when it comes to my upbringing, like nothing crazy or dark. I mean, there's always stuff, but it was just stuff that came in the natural course of life and wasn't stuff that was like visited upon me by somebody who like didn't have their act together or couldn't control their temper or something like that, So I don't know, just kind of like a really normie Midwestern upbringing.
nice.
But I watched a lot of soap operas. I often joke that my entire like narrative sensibility and interest in storytelling was somehow rooted in growing up watching. And I'm not kidding you, because we lived in the age of VCRs when I was a child. and my sisters and I were growing up, and I want to say my older sister used to record all my children, Days of Our Lives, General Hospital, Santa Barbara, and Another World.
Nice.
So, I mean, there is an era. I want to say John Black just died from Days of Our Lives. I read that somehow in the news, but I felt like a little crestfallen when I read that. I was like, damn, it's a sign of the times. But I know a certain era in the 1980s. I could tell you a lot, an embarrassing amount about what was going on in those shows. And my grandparents, I should say too, watched those shows. And I remember my grandfather in particular calling them his programs.
Yes, my grandmother called that too. My programs.
My programs. So anyway, uh, it's like a little bit far afield, but really not that much to be talking about birth order and upbringing, because it is so much a book about family. Your novel is. And I think that the fact that you are debuting with this novel in your 60s, I mean, you said it earlier that if you would have had your shit together, you would have written this book, this coming of age novel, in your 20s. But I'm sure you understand that it would not be the same book.
Oh, no. Right. Never. Also, the thing that I trace the fact that I've been writing my whole life in a very personal voice, either in my diaries or I blogged. I had a blog that I wrote every single day for 10 years, which was very much a personal voice. And everything I read, poetry-wise, I mean, I've always been interested in, first person and really personal writing. I've done a ton of worked on a ton of memoirs, read a lot of them. That's what I'm interested in. And I've been developing, in a way, Amy's voice came to me. It just flew out of me because I think that voice was very much inside me. And I've worked on her my whole life. So yeah, I could not have written this when I was 25. I could barely write a poem,
Well, listen, something that I've noticed, and a lot of it has to do with my correspondence with Aaron, my literary agent over the years, but also just in corresponding with literary agents and editors and publicists even over the years, is that it is excellent training to be. I can't think of a better training ground to be a writer than to be an editor or a literary agent, because you are reading so much. Like, some of the most well-read people I know work on the editorial and representations side of the business, and develop as a result, I think. And like I should say too, they're also reading contemporary fiction and nonfiction. So they're very tuned into how people are writing and publishing now. And does that square with your experience? I mean, do you feel similarly, or do you feel like I'm overstating it?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I think it's the biggest drawback for a writer to be in the business, because when I work on an author's book, I usually read it 4 or 5, sometimes even 6 times. That's a lot of time that I could have read War and Peace, or other great texts that I might go to my grave without reading, because I've had to spend hundreds of hours reading manuscripts, some of them bringing them from a C to a A minus, or like so much work and very little pleasure reading. I've actually become a huge audio person because I can catch up on the books that are on the bestseller list or everyone's talking about, via audio, when I'm literally working out, doing laundry, taking walks in the car. And it's a joy because now people are saying, oh, did you read, whatever? And yeah, I listened to it. I got it under my belt and I see what people are interested in and talking about. But I'm a very slow worker. I'm a very slow slow reader rather. And so, in fact, 3 years ago, after I worked on some book for, I don't know, a bazillion hours, I said, all right, I'm reading War and Peace now because I do not want to go to my grave without reading that book. And it took me a year to read it, but I read it and I'm so glad I did.
Was it
And
excellent?
excellent, excellent, brilliant. And I was also glad that I read it in my 60s, because I probably would not have appreciated it had I read it in my 20s if it was assigned to me in a class or something. Yeah, reading as an older person is amazing because you're so much smarter and kind of can figure out what's going on. And I mean, I appreciate everything on the language level or style level, but as a writer, you want to read great writing because it's going to help you get better. It's like playing with a better tennis player or a better guitarist. It ups your game. And I love working on manuscripts, and I've learned so much about every aspect of editing and writing doing that. But I do feel that if there's one thing I really look forward to in retirement is just reading the books I want to read.
Yeah, I
Slowly.
feel this. You're sort of singing my song a little bit. I'm in a similar situation where I read so much contemporary literature for this work that I do. And I'm curious to know, I mean, I've talked in the past to people who have worked in other realms, in publishing and literary agents and everything, who then go on to publish a book themselves or multiple books themselves. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to be on the other side of the equation, and to have your name on the cover and to have your work going out and being reviewed? And I know this has happened for you before with your nonfiction, but what is it like for you emotionally to experience this? And what has maybe your work behind the scenes taught you, and your experience with other authors taught you about how to handle it?
I like to say it's like being a doctor. They're not allowed to operate on themselves. It's like that. Too much. And it's in a way that the things that authors can be naive about can sort of protect them. Like nobody can pull the wool over my eyes about any aspect of it for the most part. I know too much. On the other hand, I never worked as hard for my other books. In a way, there wasn't the social media opportunities. In fact, I worked very hard for Forest for the Trees. I actually wrote probably 100 letters to every writing department in the country and every festival and conference, and offered myself and paid for myself and traveled all over the country and gave talks about how to write a query letter for the most part. It's what most people really wanted to know.
Did it help?
Did it help establish the book? Did it help people write better query letters?
Well, both, but I'm thinking of the book. Did doing all that work help the book find readers?
Yeah, because it's still in print and it's sold about 70,000 copies, and the publisher did not have a tour for me, and books like that don't tend to get reviewed, and there was clearly no media. Who's going to have you on any radio or TV with a writing book? Yeah, I mean, after I think after or before Anne Lamott's book came out, Bird by Bird, and she just that book took the world by storm. That sold still. It's a fantastic book. It's very different from mine, but no, I created the market for my book by reaching out to. That's the thing with nonfiction. It's a lot easier to promote because you're writing it for some specific group of people, and there's usually a way to reach them through their communities, whatever they are. And I have train my authors all the time to do that. If the publisher can't do it, which often they can't, it's too specialized. But you can reach out to every organization that should be interested in your book just by writing letters.
Well, when you were talking earlier about Elizabeth Wurtzel, I had that very thought where I was like, well, that's a book that I think a publicist and a journalist can so easily wrap their head around compared to, say, some elliptical novel about one's, it's a lot harder to have a conversation, unlike, say, Good Morning America, about the contents of any fiction than it is to talk about a person who has had like a really harrowing life experience that has like a lot of emotional power and stuff like that. It's just much more natural of a fit.
Yeah. But I mean, memoirists don't tend to get a ton of attention either. I mean, that's probably, I went into nonfiction because at the time everybody said there's only one person on editorial row who does literary fiction. So you better figure out how to do nonfiction, and you better find out your niche too. And I love all kinds of other nonfiction as well. But with any nonfiction, there's a market for it because it's about something concrete. And it can, usually help people or inform people or educate people. Fiction is to entertain. If there's a great hook in it, great. Maybe you'll get somewhere with it. But It's much more difficult to promote fiction. But then again, when fiction works, it can be huge because people love stories and they love escape and they love, they love fiction much more than nonfiction, I think.
Well, your career is like really unique and interesting to hear about. And I cannot leave this conversation without talking about an aspect of your life now as an author and this publication cycle in particular. You've mentioned multiple times your diaries. And as I think in conjunction with the publication of Shred Sisters, you have been like making TikTok videos. And if I may say so, you've become something of a TikTok star.
Thank you.
In your 60s. Like as you debut as a novelist, this is not something that I hear about all that often. Is debut novelist and TikTok star in her 60s. Can you talk about TikTok and BookTok in particular and your relationship to it and maybe how it's helped you find readers for your novel?
My favorite subject, so just cut me off when I bore people so much with it. But about 2 years ago, a number of publishers said things such as, nothing moves the needle anymore except TikTok. It used to be NPR. It used to be the front page of the New York Times Book Review. There were all these things that if you got them, you could think your book would take off. And none of these things move the needle that much anymore. So that's what I was hearing. Only TikTok moves the needle. So after I sold the novel, and it takes about a year before the book actually comes out, I set myself the task to see if I could figure out what TikTok was and see if I could have it help me sell my book. And then always as an agent, I'm just always curious, maybe I could help my authors if they learned how to use TikTok. So I had a year and I put my toe in and I found the BookTokers and I started watching their videos very closely, what they liked.
And just to make sure maybe there are people listening who have no frame of reference, the BookTokers, there's like a hashtag on TikTok called BookTok. Mm-hmm. And that's basically where most of the literary action happens within TikTok.
Yes. Well, actually, under BookTok, I think a lot of people don't realize in the umbrella of TikTok, there's everything that you could possibly want to learn about. If you like cars, there's car talk. I watch a lot of what is called STEM talk because I love science and they're brilliant scientists talking about their work. There's everything. So BookTok is just one lane. And within the BookTok lane, there are people who love thrillers, fantasies, romance, literary fiction. And so as you start watching people who produce this content, the algorithm feeds you more of it and you can look for more of it. And you see who the people are who have big followings. The reason they have big followings is because their content is really fun or really informative, or just sort of turning you on to new writers. I never read somebody called Clarice Lispector. She's now deceased Brazilian author whose work I have fallen madly in love with. I'd never even heard about her until I saw a bunch of literary.
She was so glamorous too. I mean, the whole thing, right?
I don't know how it got past me. And so I started watching and I started commenting. You have to kind of comment to sort of become you have to become part of the community. And then that's one way to be a part of the BookTok is just watching and commenting. And then the other is creating content. And so I thought I would try that because as a blogger, I was someone who was very comfortable putting out content every day. So I started putting these little literary things, I didn't want to be on camera. Right. I didn't feel confident about that. So I was making, I don't know, all kinds of showing books and things like that. I can't even remember, but nothing that gave me any traction whatsoever. And then I met a good friend, actually another one of Erin's clients, who's a big BookTok influencer. And she wanted to learn about being an agent. And I wanted to learn about TikTok. So we said, well, let's have lunch and we'll, kind of help each other. And she told me you have to get on camera if you want any traction at all. And you have to do something. Think of it as your own TV channel that people would want to see every day or come back to. Like, you can't be all over the place. You need to get in a lane and do something you can do. And she said, you should give publishing advice, right? Like, that's what you do. And I said, I don't want to do that. I'm bored with that. I've done it, been there, done that. And there are really good people on the platform giving publishing advice, by the way. So I went home that night and I took out my old journals, which I have a huge stack. And I thought, I wonder if I started to read from these, if I go back into these, what I would find and if people would find it interesting. And I made one post saying that that was going to be my project. And that post went viral. So after getting no traction at all, I suddenly had one post that had, 600,000 views and tons of comments. And I struck a nerve, and that was it. I started reading, 4 or 5 sentences out of my diary every day. I do it in my bathrobe and my pajamas. I don't do my hair. I don't do makeup. I don't do any of that stuff. It's just, I do my writing in the morning. Then I do my TikTok entry. They haven't all gone viral like that, but I've definitely found a lot of young people just really identify. My diaries are super sad, struggling with bipolar, struggling with depression, not knowing what was happening, not knowing why I couldn't connect, why I couldn't have love, didn't have boyfriends and all that. It's just a one lonely screed, but people seem to relate, people in their 20s, your 20s are fucking hard. If you don't know what you want and you don't know how to get love and, you just don't know where you're ever going to fit in. And that's what my diaries speak to. So I've been really immersed in them and seeing who I was and seeing who I am now. It's very encouraging, right? That you can come through all that.
That's what I think. I mean, I've watched several of your TikToks. I'm curious. So you do the video editing yourself?
Yeah.
Like you just with what? Like iMovie, or I'm curious to know. Or do you do that within TikTok?
I do it within TikTok.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know how any of this stuff
My
works.
skills are so rudimentary. I wish I could improve on them. I just don't have. I'm not good with that stuff. But yeah.
But you don't need to be. They're perfectly suited to TikTok. I mean, they look sophisticated to my eye. What do I know? But
yeah, I don't even have a it's handheld. I hold my phone and then I edit it and I add a little music, and every now and then I try something else, but yeah, they're pretty basic.
Okay, but I want to drill down into this a little bit more because I post clips from this show on TikTok. That's the limit of my interaction. And I too have this internal resistance to appearing on camera. I mean, I appear as the interlocutor on this show, but I'm not like talking to my phone because I'm like, I don't know what I would say. But when I watch your videos, I can see the appeal. There's something incredibly poignant about watching a woman later in her life confront her internal self, her interior from when she was in her 20s and struggling. And then to have you read aloud from the diary and to then reflect, all these years later on who you were then, and to have compassion for yourself, and to also maybe serve as a model for younger people in particular who might be watching it and realizing that whatever situation you're in at that time in your life, like however permanent it may feel then, whatever really difficult emotional state that you might be in or might feel stuck in, there's something moving about realizing that it too will pass.
Yeah.
And so there's that, but then there's also, I think, at the level of concept, something so genius about doing what you're doing, because you have this huge stack of diaries. So you've got a mountain of material to mine. You never have to wake up in the morning thinking like, oh God, what am I going to say on TikTok today? Like, you've come up with a format that has an audience, and that might be part of the key. You've got to find something that you can comfortably do consistently that has like maybe some emotional content and that is of use to people. And it also has to be a certain length, right? Like, you can't go on a TikTok. Like, it sort of feels like 30 seconds or less tends to be the right window.
Mm-hmm. That's all true. All true. Yeah. I mean, the people who I tend to watch are either doing really good reviews of books, or there's one influencer who I love called is at Tell the Bees, and he does cultural criticism, and he basically does the most serious critique of The Bachelor and all the dating programs that you've ever seen, as well as just lots of other. He loves pop culture, but he really drills down. He's a sociologist, and I watch. Most people watch a TikTok video for about 3 seconds before they scroll. So he does really long ones. I watch the whole thing, just because he's so good. Um, Other people, I just feel somehow connected to it. Like right now, there's a particular book talker she's been a ghostwriter her whole life. She's apparently written many, many, many New York Times bestselling ghosted many books. She's finally out with her own book. And this journey of coming out as the writer and putting your name on the book and just watching this cocoon become a butterfly, I'm fascinated by her. There are people like lately, the algorithm's just been feeding me people who are talking about their dating life, and getting shit on. And I'm fascinated. I just fascinated by everything. There's so much on there, but yeah, in the book world, I was really feeling very burned out about publishing, and this BookTok community has completely reawakened my interest in book. These people they're real book people. They're not, people put them down because they're not real critics or whatever, but they
probably have more influence than real critics in a lot of cases,
Oh,
right?
well,
I mean,
now they definitely do. They definitely do. But I'm a literary person. I'm watching the people who pretty much like literary, and a lot of people love classics on Book Talk as well. There's a lot of conversation around classics, and yeah, I mean, it's not all Sally Rooney and Colleen Hoover, but even that stuff's fascinating to me. Why did Colleen Hoover connect with millions and millions of people? If you're in publishing and you don't want to understand that, I don't get it. I want to understand it.
so if somebody is an author of, like, say, literary fiction, that's mostly who I talk to on this show, or literary nonfiction, there's places on, because I think my understanding of Book Talk is that it's like, oh, lots of romance, lots of sort of like genre fiction, horror, that kind of stuff. But is there a real place in Book Talk for literary fiction? And is there like a unique hashtag for it, or is it just under the Book Talk umbrella?
Well, there are plenty of hashtags like literary fiction or fiction. I sort of see my lane as sad literary girls in a way. There are no, it's really, there's just a lot of, like I said, I discovered Clarice Lispector on Book Talk. I'd never read Giovanni's Room until I saw this wonderful gay influencer go on and read everything by Baldwin. And then I started to read Baldwin. I'd never read Giovanni's Room. It's probably one of my top 5 books now. Everybody's reading Dostoevsky's White Nights right now. I don't know why. I have to pick it up. It's a shorter book. There's a ton of love for Toni Morrison, ton of love for Joan Didion, ton of love for Patti Smith Just Kids. That's where I also really started to find my people. Yeah, they're all out there. There's no reason to not think that a literary book couldn't find an audience on Book Talk.
So what do you, like, if you were advising somebody, like if I'm like, what do I do? I've got a TikTok. Like I said, I'm posting clips. Like, I got to come up with some TV show idea, basically, that's 15 to 30 seconds per episode in length. Hopefully, like, find a format that I can be consistent with.
Yes.
And then just post once a day or more, or what would you recommend?
Well, once a day. Some people do more. I don't think you have to do more than that. Once a day is a lot. I think maybe, like, I guess what I really want to know is, you've been interviewing people. Who are you and why? Or what do you connect with when you talk to people? Or what do you know about people vis-a-vis what you do? People get onto TikTok, people watch because they either want to be entertained or they want to learn something, but they definitely want to connect. And, I think there's got to be a reason why you've become someone so expert at interviewing other people, right? You're a great listener. You've got a lot of curiosity. Things like that are obvious, but there's a lot that isn't obvious, and that's something that would be intriguing to me. Or maybe funny outtakes, or I don't know. We could talk about it more, but I'm sure that there's a way if you're interested in doing it. But nobody gets on it in BookTok. There's not a ton of sponsorships. Like, people aren't getting rich. It's really a love thing. Some people are sponsored.
But the point, though, really is that for a book, like a book like yours, if you start to develop an audience and become a known member of this community, it can help move copies of a book.
Well, the other thing I did is I started writing letters, getting back to the letters, emails to a lot of influencers who liked the kind of books that I thought they might like my book. And I wrote to them and I told them why I liked their accounts and why I felt connected to what their work was. And I was coming out with a first novel that would they be interested in taking a look? And if they said yes, I sent them a galley with another personal note and actually a box of Peeps, because BookTokers do love swag, and Peeps feature in my book. There's a scene with Peeps. So I sent my galley and Peeps and a note. And a bunch of them have, been talking about the book on BookTok, but that was outreach I did. Some publishers know who all the influencers are and send them books and galleys and swag, lots of swag. And some publishers are really on top of it, and some publishers haven't figured it out yet. But I took it upon myself to reach out to influencers who I thought might like my book.
And they were what? This was the sad girl? Like, was it like, what was the commonality between these people that you reached out to?
Well, anybody who liked Just Kids, I felt completely connected with, and I said, I worked on Just Kids, and amazing that you're talking about this book on your platform. And I went out, and then just, a lot of people who liked Sally Rooney. A lot of people love The Idiot, the Alif Batuman book, and the Emma Klein books. A lot of books where there's a young woman protagonist. Those are people that I reached out to, I would say, for the most part. And there are a lot of those. I mean, dark academia is another huge interest in BookTok. And that happened, I think, during COVID. So The Secret History is like everybody's favorite dark academia. And then there's a bunch of others. But I mostly reached out to, just literary people, or I just liked the way they talked about books. I just felt like they were cool, or they were interesting, or a lot of them are super quirky, people that honestly, I'd rather be at a cocktail party with them than a lot of other people.
Well, hey, I think what you're talking about really is the fact that, you talked about how this kind of rejuvenated your faith in publishing or your love of like bookmaking. And I think it's got to be because you're actually interacting with the people out there who are moved by the work, as opposed to constantly surrounded by like the business side of it and people who might be cynical, having spent years in the trenches doing that sort of stuff. Like, when you see the impact that books actually have on people, and you can really feel a genuine excitement coming off of somebody who's just read a book that they love, that's what it's about.
Oh my God, 100%. And some of these kids, like, I met one BookToker who felt that, Autobiography of a Face was one of the most important books they've ever read. And when they met me, who edited that book, and then we moved on to Anne Patchett and Truth and Beauty and like other memoirs. And I mean, really deeply connecting over books. And I'm not saying that I'd become deeply cynical, because I still am so passionate about the books that I work on, but I was becoming really cynical about the industry. And as I said, sort of burnout. And this has just been completely rejuvenating to me, seeing how to connect with people on the platform, seeing all the enthusiasm for books. It's genuine, and it's, it's just so nice to know that how much time people are spending on books. Even people who show you every bookstore, that people go on vacations and go to every bookstore and show you the bookstores they're in love with. They show you the diaries that they're writing. There's communities within communities of people who are getting together and going on, book outings together. I mean, it's not just being on a screen.
Well, and I think it's unprecedented in a lot of ways for people's love of books to be accessible and to have these kinds of dialogues happening in a public sphere. I mean, obviously, like little book clubs in your suburban neighborhood or whatever, like that stuff's been going on for a long time. But, I think maybe the visual aspect of TikTok is what distinguishes it from, say, like Twitter. Lots of people are chattering there. People are chattering on Facebook and everything else. But I think there's something about the fact that you're seeing people's faces and hearing their voices, and then also maybe seeing the book cover. They're holding the book physically, the object in their hands, and there's something about that combination, I think, that has made it so powerful, and kind of seems like malpractice in a way if you want to sell books. And like you say, I think you mentioned earlier when you were talking about how writers are narcissists, and the most normal ones might be like the genre fiction writers because they're truly trying to reach a mass audience and communicate with people. But on some level, anybody who's publishing anything is trying to do that, whether they admit it or not. And if that's the case, how can you not at least explore BookTok as a method of communicating with people?
Well, as I tell all my authors who say, oh, I hate doing this, I hate doing that. Okay, well, what do you like doing? What are you good at doing? Like, at the very least, you've got to be a great letter writer if you're a writer. People love getting real mail. I made 400 pieces of stationery with my book jacket on it, cost nothing at Tyco. And I just send out notes to all the booksellers I've ever met, all the librarians I've ever met. I mean, I'm still doing what I did with Forest for the Trees. It's elbow grease. You just want to reach people. So how? So if you're not going to get on TikTok, which I totally understand if you're, above the age of 30, like my daughter's 27, she's not on TikTok. She's embarrassed. Now that the New York Times said I was a TikTok star, it's okay with her. But up until this moment, so mortifying, just so cringeworthy, which I do get. But you don't have to be on TikTok, but you have to understand that if you want to be Emily Dickinson and have nobody, not get read, that's okay. But if you want to get read, you have to reach out. You have to find ways to reach out to reach your audience. And if you think the publisher is going to do it for you, you'll certainly be lucky if things line up and it all quote unquote happens, whatever that means. But you've written a book. That's a tremendous thing. It's your calling card if you want to reach people. It's like if you were to open a store, would you just put an open sign and expect people to come in? No, you'd market it. You'd let people know you're here. Come on in. We've got some great stuff for you. That's what I try to convince all my authors to do, is whatever platform or whatever letter writing campaign or reaching out to every organization that might be interested in your book through an email now. Addresses are easily available. It's actually not that hard. It's not difficult to come up with the ideas. You've got to execute. I tell all my clients, put away some piece of your advance to spend on marketing, including hiring an assistant for 2 or 3 hours a week to help you. So just it's a lot of elbow grease,
Right. Yeah. Just like it's like sealing envelopes and dropping things off at the post office and, buying a bunch of Peeps, that sort of stuff.
Yes. Or like I have my assistant has put together an Excel spreadsheet of everybody that I've written to, and all these categories I've talked about. I could not possibly keep it straight. And I'm very bad at Excel spreadsheets. And, she does that for me and just helps me in any way. Then she only works for me a few hours a week, but it makes such a difference in terms of, getting stuff out the door and
Keeping you organized.
and also just having someone excited for you. It's lonely. No, nobody gives a shit until somebody gives a shit, and it's just nice having somebody be enthusiastic, like, on your team. And I'm very lucky because the Grove team is amazing, amazing, amazing group of people. And they've worked together, all of them, for so many decades, and they believe in their mission. They're an independent publisher. And I've gotten very, very lucky with the most brilliant editor, I think, in all of New York and all of that. But then, your book is your calling card and you can do anything with it. And you don't have to stop when the 6 weeks that your publisher is going to devote to it is over. You got some money. You don't have to pay it back if the book doesn't work, right? Like if the book doesn't sell any copies, nobody asks you for your advance back. You still have that money. Maybe you're paying off student loans. Maybe you're paying your mortgage or diapers. But if you have a little left over, put it into marketing yourself and your book. That's my
Well,
advice.
it's inspiring, Betsy. I feel like what you're doing now. I think it's really cool. Shred Sisters is a wonderfully absorbing novel. I guess we didn't get too deep into the weeds on the plot. We kind of talked about it as a family story, a coming of age story, but it's really like emotionally evolving. It's a story about a family, and I have to say before I let you go that I think maybe my favorite character in the whole book was the mother. And I don't know what that says about me, but I found her hilarious. There's something blunt and there's a comedic. I'm sure you probably laughed when you were writing, but I really loved that mother character. She would kind of say things that nobody else would say, or I don't know. There was a transparency, like a no filtered quality to her that I guess I just appreciate in people and characters on the page. So
I really appreciate that because I had so much fun and really channeled my mother was one judgmental hoot of a lady.
You never had to guess what she was thinking, right? I mean,
Never,
ever.
never,
Well,
never.
it's a wonderful book and a wonderful achievement, and I congratulate you on it. And I thank you for taking the time to talk with me about it and, all the rest of your efforts in and around books over the years. So thank you.
Thank you so much. This was so much fun.